Good evening and welcome. I'm Robert Pekkanen, a professor in the Jackson School and the chair of the Jackson School Japan Studies program. I'm very glad to see you all here. I was a little worried with the beautiful weather, but I'm glad it encouraged you to also have a beautiful event this evening with a great speaker. The Griffith and Patricia Way Lecture is the signature event on the annual calendar of the Jackson School Japan Studies program. So I'd like to say a few words about the rich history of this lecture series, and then I will turn to introduce our terrific speaker, Tobias Harris. But first, let me recognize Professor Clark Sorensen, who is a longtime professor at the University of Washington, an anthropologist of Korea, and a member of the illustrious Way family. Thank you for coming, Clark. This year marks the 20th year, maybe actually 8:01 p.m., it'll start the 20th year, but the 20th year of the Griffith and Patricia Way Lecture, thanks to the generous support of friends of the Way family. While Griff and Pat passed away a few years ago, I am sure that they are both with us here in spirit, as I think this is the type of event that they would really enjoy. They were lifelong advocates of Japan studies, including Japanese art and culture. Griff, a native of Seattle, served as a Japanese interpreter and translator in the Navy and helped save thousands of lives during World War II. He was a UW Law School Distinguished Alumni Award recipient. He practiced law in Japan and the United States and served on the boards of the Jackson School, the Journal of Japanese Studies, the Seattle Art Museum, and as a trustee of the Blakemore Foundation. Patricia O'Sullivan Way was also raised in Seattle. And when the war broke out, she was at UW and started studying Japanese. She met Griff on a train from Seattle to Boulder, Colorado, where the Navy had selected them both to attend the famous intensive Japanese language training before serving in the war. Pat was commissioned as a Navy ensign, one of just 69 women accepted for voluntary emergency service who completed this rigorous advanced language training. She served as a Japanese language interpreter in the offices of Naval Intelligence and Naval Communications in Washington, D.C. during the war. She returned to UW to finish her degree, graduating Phi Beta Kappa. They married in 1946 and were married for nearly 73 years. Griff also helped establish UW's Asian Law Program, the first program of its kind in the United States. And he also was involved in the founding of the Law in Japan Journal and the Journal of Japanese Studies at UW. Griff helped the Japan Studies program on several critical occasions. He understood the importance of keeping key institutions alive, and he was a great believer in the Inter-University Center for Japanese Language Studies in Japan. When the Japanese government cut funding for the center, it was on the verge of closing, but as trustee for the Blakemore Foundation, Griff made sure all Blakemore Japan Fellows went there. This support helped the center survive until some significant donations came in and put it on the stable footing that it enjoys to this day. The IUC is the closest thing that exists to the type of intensive language training that he and Pat received in the Navy Language School during the war. Griff wanted others to have a similar opportunity to what he and Pat had experienced in the Navy Language School, which changed their life trajectory. Almost all of the UW's Japan faculty, Devinder probably knows the exact number, but I know she was there, and I was there, Sadia was there, Mark, all of us went there. Griff and Pat also acquired an extensive collection of modern Japanese paintings and prints, which have toured several museums. Now our community enjoys several of these pieces in the Seattle Art Museum's permanent collection. Griff and Pat were both recently interred in Arlington Cemetery. Griff and Pat remain great life role models for us all, and not just for their contribution to Japan studies and their military service, They generously took precious time out of their busy lives to use their knowledge, social networks, and resources to deeply contribute to their communities in many ways. For this, as well as their exceptional integrity, generosity, and humility, they remain great sources of inspiration. We at the Jackson School of Japan Studies program are honored to contribute to keeping their legacy bright and nurturing for the future through our stewardship of this annual lecture. Let me now turn to introduce this evening's speaker, Mr. Tobias Harris. I'm a huge fan of Tobias Harris, but I had never met him until last evening, so chalk one more up to how the Way Lecture is nurturing connections for the future. Tobias is founder and principal at Japan Foresight LLC, a boutique consulting firm focused on Japanese political risk and economic policies. In addition to his business ventures, he previously worked in the think tank world, in the German Marshall Fund and the Center for American Progress. He is an ABD in the political science department at MIT and holds an MPhil from the University of Cambridge and a BA from Brandeis. Two more things I want to tell you about Tobias. First, you should absolutely subscribe to his Substack, Observing Japan. I promise you, I'm not gaining a commission. But
we'll talk about that later.
Take out your phone, subscribe now.
Oh, there's also a student discount.
Oh, is there?
Yes.
Is there a faculty discount? No. Yeah. It's great. Students, you should subscribe to this. And if I were restricted to a single English language news source on Japanese politics, it would be Observing Japan. Essential reading. All the Japan politics specialists say, no, read it. It's great stuff. I just don't know when he sleeps, but there's a lot of posts. It's very high quality, and it's worth every penny, especially at the student discount. I didn't see any phones out, but you should do it. Second, Tobias authored a book in 2020 with an expanded edition in 2023, The Iconoclast, Shinzo Abe and the New Japan. This is a great book. I particularly appreciate it not only for its subtle placing of Abe's brand of conservatism into the context of the different streams circulating in Japan's LDP, something I love, and something that I think Tobias's academic training positions him to do very well, and his writing for Substack means that it's actually enjoyable to read. And I think it's also one of the lamentably few English language biographies of Japanese people, especially Japanese politicians. Since Abe Shinzo is arguably the most important Japanese person who lived in the 21st century, he really deserves a biography. I was very glad to see him get one. I assigned this book, the whole book, in my class on Japanese political parties. It's a great book, and I think that it also helped me to get the students to see Japanese politicians as individuals, not a large group, not a party, not a national decision-making process, but individuals engaging in contentious action with ambitions, making choices. That's great. And I think the book succeeds really well at these multiple levels of analysis and also helping students, many of whom have never been to Japan, identify what's going on with Japanese agency. I devote 1 week in the class to reading this biography, and I assigned every student a book review. Write the book review, and then we'll discuss in class. When I taught this class 2 times ago, one of the students, who was a double major, also in drama, asked me if she could write, instead of a book review, a dramatic scene based on the book. Sound good to me, so I said yes. It was fantastic. It brought to life the drama of Japanese politics vividly. I told Tobias this last night, and apparently now he wants a copy of this dramatic scene so he can approach producers about a potential hit musical, Abe. I'll mention that this student went on to win the Dean's Medal as the top student in the division. So the scene was really good. Well, I don't know if we have any dramatic reenactments in store in tonight's remarks, but I hope you'll join me in enthusiastically welcoming Tobias to our campus.
That was, that was such a kind introduction. I'm so floored. Robert, thank you. And thank you for bringing me out here. Thank you to the Japanese Studies program here at the Jackson School. Thank you actually for really, I'm humbled to be part of this lecture series, and Seattle, University of Washington, this is, has been such an important institution for Japanese studies in the past and in the present and into the future. And so really it's so humbling to have the opportunity to be here, to speak with all of you. Really, I'm really grateful. And so thank you for making this possible. Thank you, of course, also to the Consul General for being here. I hope it's of interest, and really pleased to have you here and to have the opportunity to meet you. So with that, so when I was first invited to deliver this talk, Japan's political situation looked a little different than it does now. I mean, we think we started talking maybe in December or January. And so let's rewind a few months and think about that. So at that point, we already had Prime Minister Takaichi Sanae. She had taken over Japan's first female prime minister, and she was enjoying a surge in popularity. But at the same time, she was also the head of a minority government. She lacked majorities in both houses of the Diet. Her Liberal Democratic Party had cast off its longtime coalition and electoral partner Komeito, and it was unclear how durable a new relationship that the LDP had formed with the Osaka-based Isshin no Kai would be. There was some speculation around that time, maybe there'd be an election, maybe there's not, maybe it'll be in the spring. It was unclear how this situation would resolve itself. Now, of course, it is May, it is Golden Week still, and Takaichi not only remains extraordinarily popular, but after gambling on a snap election in February, she commands the largest majority the LDP has ever wielded in the House of Representatives, a supermajority even without Isshin no Kai's help. And it's actually worth pausing and reflecting on that. The LDP just celebrated its 70th birthday. I mean, in those 70 years, you've never had a leader enjoy a majority in the lower house as large as the one she has. It was a remarkable achievement, and I think it's worth just noting just how substantial that victory was. The year started with the Constitutional Democratic Party serving as a significant check on the government through its control over the lower house budget committee. Now, the CDP in the lower house has not only lost its committee chairs, but has been folded into a tenuous new party with Komeito, now called the Centrist Reform Alliance. The government still lacks a majority in the upper house, of course, at least until 2028, unless the LDP can entice some legislators to defect or to sign on as a new coalition partner. But with the majority in the lower house, the supermajority in the lower house, the government can outmaneuver the upper house if it has to. In short, from a situation last year where it appeared that Japan's politics would be stuck in a period of fragmentation for some time going forward, there's certainly speculation that we're witnessing the reemergence of the one-strong, many-weak party system that characterized the era of the second Abe administration after 2012. But what I want to discuss today is whether we are witnessing the beginning of a new era of extended dominance, or whether this will in fact prove to be more of a passing moment between periods of instability. On the one hand, it's hard to argue with the numbers. The LDP has 316 of the 465 seats in the lower house, 352 together with its partner Isshin no Kai. Takaichi remains popular to an extent virtually without precedent this far into her government. So her government just passed the 6-month mark. Her government's net approval remains at roughly plus 40, an extraordinary level at this stage. At a basic level, this enables her to overawe both opposition parties and would-be critics within the LDP. It's really hard. The LDP has a history of somewhat tumultuous internal politics. It's really hard to speak up when you have a prime minister as popular as she is. She is poised now to use her majority to follow through on the agenda she's outlined, perhaps up to and including constitutional revision as she pledged at the LDP's convention in April. And I just have a chart of, this is based, if you do subscribe to Observing Japan, I do have a moving average that I keep track of And this just shows you not just how strong her numbers are, but how stable they've been. There's just has not been a whole lot of movement in her support. However, these numbers do not tell the whole story. First, as large as the LDP's victory was, there are a few details that give one pause. The LDP did not clear 50% of the vote in either the constituency vote, so of course in the lower house you have single-member districts and you also have proportional representation. It did not reach 50% in either category of voting. And while the party's constituency vote total was significantly better than its abysmal performance in 2024 when it lost a majority, it was fewer than 100,000 votes better than its performance in 2021 when it won only 187 constituencies compared with the 249 constituencies it won in 2026. So you have to look, when you start looking under the hood, the scale of the victory is a little more complicated. The implication of these numbers is that Takaichi and the LDP profited from a disastrous misfire by the CDP and Komeito. And we don't have to go too much into those details, but basically they threw together an alliance on very short notice, and it was an alliance that really ended up being less than the sum of its parts rather than being an additive relationship. And ultimately that led CDP voters to stay home or vote for other opposition parties, and a wholesale collapse in some districts of the CDP vote. And so the LDP won in districts that I don't think the LDP itself expected to win. I mean, there's no better example of how accidental the LDP's victory was that they actually were they won 15 more seats than they ended up taking because they ran out of candidates. I mean, that was a party that by its own admission was not expecting to win on the scale that they won. So it was something of a fluke of the electoral system. You know, the fact that first past the post districts can be somewhat wonky and give outsized majorities, and the LDP absolutely benefited from that. But even if we accept that a prime minister has to be both lucky and good to endure, and once a parliamentary majority exists, it doesn't really matter how it came to be, there are still reasons to question whether we're watching the beginning of a durable Takaichi era. It is helpful, I think, to look at the factors that enabled Abe to dominate Japanese politics for the better part of a decade and measure where Takaichi stands by comparison. So, of course, Robert, actually you mentioned Abe is the most consequential Japanese of the 21st century. I mean, perhaps there's someone else who could compete for that title. I don't know, we'll see. Well, he still has time to add, to run up the score maybe a little bit. But I would posit that if we're looking at what enabled Abe to become the longest-serving Japanese prime minister since 1945, by some measures ever, I think you can look at this list. So he enjoyed weak and fragmented opposition parties. He had a stable coalition that had control of both houses. He had a unified LDP. He enjoyed what I will argue was post-populist politics. He had a leadership style, I think, that ended up being conducive to a durable government. And he enjoyed what I think was a fairly benign international security and economic environment, at least in hindsight. So let's take each of these in turn. First, weak and fragmented opposition parties. One way to think about the second Abe administration is that it was the long hangover not only from the DPJ's turbulent 3 years in power, but also from a decade of nascent two-party competition that also contributed to more intense competition within the LDP during that decade as it struggled to respond to the DPJ challenge. By 2012, the DPJ was in shambles, the public had given the party a chance, and it was fed up with the results, and the LDP was ready to step in again as the natural party of government. The DPJ would then spend its time in opposition during the Abe years, cycling through leaders, changing names, and then eventually splintering in 2017. There are multiple reasons for this outcome, but at a basic level, the DPJ burned through years' worth of trust and was unable to recover while in opposition. It is on this score that Takaichi likely faces the greatest similarity to the Abe years. CDP leader Noda Yoshihiko's gamble to create the Centrist Reform Alliance backfired spectacularly. His successor, Ogawa Junya, is now at the helm basically of a Frankenstein's monster of a party. As the CDP and Komeito merged in one house, but not in the other, it hasn't merged in prefectural chapters, which is pretty significant seeing as how you have nationwide local elections next year, so you would think you would want an effective brand at the local level. This gamble that they attempted, creating two parties with virtually no support among young people, gambling that they could somehow do better together, It failed and left the CRA really trying to figure out how it can appeal to a significant chunk of the electorate. And frankly, in the months since the election, it has shown no signs of figuring it out. Meanwhile, the Democratic Party for the People, the other major DPJ successor party, cannot decide if it wants to be a coalition partner of the LDP, an aspirant to be the leading opposition party, or a partner with the CRA in challenging the LDP. Its leader, Tamaki Yuichiro, is mercurial, to say the least, often indecisive, and frequently just complicates everything and has trouble making up his mind. The left wing, meanwhile, appears to be in steep decline. Both the Japanese Communist Party and Reiwa Shinsengumi perform poorly, and the Social Democrats, the lingering remains of what had once been Japan's largest opposition party, essentially looks like a dead party walking. But the center, center-right, and right-wing opposition votes, meanwhile, are deeply divided between the CRA, the DPFP, Sansaito, the upstart far-right party, which I will talk about more in a little bit, and another upstart party that emerged this time around, Team Mirai. In short, it is difficult to imagine how any of these opposition parties, or even combination of opposition parties, could threaten LDP rule for the foreseeable future. For now, it really does seem like, again, the LDP has been given a new lease on life and is once again seen as perhaps the only party capable of controlling the government. Second, a stable coalition with control of both houses of the Diet. But once you look beyond the weakness of the opposition, you already start seeing some complications that Takaichi faces. Under the second Abe administration, and also during the first, but we're more interested in the second, the LDP and Komeito actually had a functional, long-standing working partnership, both electorally, very importantly for a lot of LDP lawmakers, and in government. They'd really figured out a way, after at that point it had been a dozen years, of really figuring out how to work together despite really substantial differences on policy. They really had strong coordinating mechanisms. They really knew how to work together. It still remains to be seen whether the LDP and Isshin no Kai partnership will be able to get to this point. They've not figured out electoral cooperation. Isshin's marginal and declining presence outside the Kansai region reduces value to the LDP, while its strength within Kansai means that electoral cooperation would come at the expense of LDP branches in Osaka and neighboring prefectures. Meanwhile, even before the general election, Isshin no Kai has learned that its policy leverage on the LDP was limited. While Isshin discusses itself as an accelerant, in contrast to Komeito once describing itself as a brake on some of the LDP's more conservative impulses, it is not at all clear that the party can make the LDP do things that the LDP itself would prefer not to do. And that, of course, can be corrosive to cooperation if Isshin feels like it doesn't actually have any say on the direction of policy. The LDP may just not need Isshin no Kai very much, at least not as much as Isshin no Kai may need the LDP and Takaichi in order to deliver their policies. Of course, not only is the LDP-Isshin coalition weaker, but they also don't have a majority in the upper house, forcing the government to seek additional partners to pass legislation. But it's not just about numbers in the upper house. The opposition's strength means that the LDP shares power with opposition parties on upper house committees, meaning that even if the government can find the 4 votes it needs to pass legislation in the upper house, it still can't manage the agenda for the upper house without the cooperation of the opposition. Takaichi learned this the hard way when she could not move her budget through on her timetable due to the divided upper house. And I don't know how much people were following this, but this was the story in March where the Prime Minister said, I'm going to get my budget through by March 31st because it has to be done, even though that they lost basically a month due to the general election campaign. And as it turned out, she was not actually able to do that until April. So it was a hard-earned lesson, perhaps, for the Prime Minister. There may also be an argument that the LDP's strength in the lower house could make for more, not less, opposition in the upper house, insofar as opposition parties' lawmakers and also LDP lawmakers see themselves as having a crucial role to play as the only institutional check remaining on the executive. All of this means more friction in the process of governing the country compared to the second Abe administration, where there was a brief moment at the start where he didn't have control of the upper house, but then from 2013 onward, the LDP and Komeito had control of the upper house, and for stretches of that time, they had a supermajority in the upper house. Just a very different way of relating to the legislature than Takaichi finds herself now. Third, a unified LDP. And this is of course Robert's bread and butter, and we've learned a lot from him over the years about the history of contestation within the LDP. But a hallmark of Abe's dominance as leader of the LDP and as prime minister was an LDP that was united, maybe to an extent that we've never seen before. I mean, the history of the LDP is a history of conflict. It's a history of competition between the bureaucratic faction and the party men. It's a competition between factions. It's a competition between different ideological tendencies and different policy specialists fighting for a bigger share of the pie. I mean, the story of the LDP is, it's a party where you have a significant period of its history described as the Warring States period. I mean, the LDP the story of the LDP is these people don't actually like each other all that much, but they dislike other parties more, and that keeps them together. So it was a very unusual period that during the Abe years he managed to subsume many of these conflicts. Some of this was downstream of other factors. It's not that Abe was magically making peace with everyone and everyone just decided to get along. Some of it, I think, was the memory of having lost power in 2009 that was very fresh. I mean, I think the LDP really did not enjoy having to be in opposition again. And so when they came back, you had lots of people who said, all right, well, we spent the years before losing fighting, let's maybe try to avoid that and try to stay in power for longer. You also had, I think, a situation where you had in 2012, you had an enormous landslide that brought large numbers of LDP members into the Diet. But many of them were newly elected Abe loyalists. They were people who owed their seats to Abe, had been nominated by him, and so you had these loyalists, and then they won election after election, and it was easy to follow the leader. This was someone, who did the thing they loved to do. Like, we have power, you're winning elections, we will follow you, and we will keep following you. It also probably helped Abe that the LDP at the time had a functioning factional structure, which, factions, for all that they're maligned, they do some very important work socializing members, they regulate conflict, they ensure that there's a process for distributing power and distributing seats and distributing cabinet posts and really just managing some of these internal divisions in the party. And you had that, and you also had a prime minister who came out of the party's largest faction, which also helped maybe keep things under control a little bit. And Abe, to give him credit as well, he also made some astute personnel choices repeatedly. He was very good at finding ways of incorporating would-be rivals, at harnessing both his allies and also potential opponents, and ensuring that either they were too busy to oppose him or that they were marginalized and they weren't causing any trouble for him. And he repeatedly did this. He repeatedly found ways to use people in ways that made sure that they weren't going to be causing intra-party friction for him. It is hard to see, as of right now, it is hard to see the LDP uniting behind Takaichi to the same extent. And there's a few reasons for this. So first of all, Takaichi, like her predecessor Ishiba before her, is something of an outsider. She's an outsider in that she opted out of the faction system pretty early, relatively early in her career. She basically protested. She had been part of the then Machimoto faction and didn't like that they weren't facilitating Abe's return more. And so she left, and so she's been out of the faction system for a long time. And she burned a lot of bridges in the process. A lot of her former allies from what became the Abe faction actually did not appreciate her doing that. In general, she has some ideological friends and has run in sort of an ideological pack, but she's not someone who is necessarily, she hasn't been a faction leader. She hasn't had a strong army of LDP lawmakers behind her. And in some ways, she managed to cobble together a winning coalition in last year's LDP leadership election as much from the mistakes and divisions among her rivals. I mean, if you look at the numbers, and I don't have those at my fingertips, I would have to go back and look at my notes on this. But if you look at the math, if the second and third place candidates, so Koizumi Shinjiro, who ended up making it to the runoff, and Hayashi Yoshimasa had coordinated better, basically they would have made it impossible for her to win. If one of them had decided, all right, I'm going to back the other one, they could have reassembled the coalition that Ishiba won with over Takaichi and basically won on the exact same grounds again last year. That would have been very possible. But in the end, you didn't have that successful coalition building. And Takaichi was able to sort of pry enough people away because they ultimately decided they didn't want Koizumi winning. and she put together her own sort of ragtag, complicated winning coalition to win the leadership. And as a result, it's unclear how much enthusiasm, how deep her friendships are, how deep her relationships are with much of the party. Now, of course, winning can help. You win a big election, that's going to buy you some credit, but it is actually shocking the degree, given how popular she is, given how fresh the elation from that electoral victory is, how much unease and how much dissatisfaction you find when you talk to people in the LDP. I was just there last month, and even though I've been reading the tabloids about just how much murmuring there is in the LDP about dissatisfaction with her leader, I mean, it was right out in the open. I mean, you heard it over and over again in conversations. So she doesn't have the party united behind her in sort of heart and soul in the way that I think Abe actually enjoyed for most of his tenure. That the party was really behind him. He was the vehicle to the party wielding power. You do have a situation now where, so a few years ago, the LDP's factions all formally dissolved one after the other in the wake of the so-called slush fund scandal. And we're now in a position where maybe the factions are starting ever so slowly to reemerge, and this is not a surprising development. I think it was always a matter of if and not, or when and not if. It seemed that they were going to come back sooner or later. But it is interesting when you look at this factional reformation and what they're doing and how they're thinking, that there's lots of talk about this is actually preparing for the LDP leadership election next year, and not let's reform the factions so that the prime minister has a stronger base. I mean, so there's still questions about who can she rely on when the chips are down. If she gets into trouble, who is she going to be able to turn to for help and for support? You would think that one option might be the 66 newly elected Takaichi children, the new lower house members, who could be something of an oendan for the prime minister, but it is unclear whether she wants to or is able to really do the work of pulling that into a group that can stand behind her. And in fact, these nascent factions are actually trying to pluck them away and pull them into their orbit instead of letting them be part of sort of a kind of informal Takaichi group. So it just seems in general that she doesn't have the relationships with the party, doesn't have the deep relationships, and hasn't really invested the time and the effort in that kind of relationship building to make for a more unified party. The press has been full, as I mentioned, of talk with LDP lawmakers grumbling about her slighting the party, not listening to them. And in particular, this has been a problem in the upper house, where after she disregarded the upper house LDP's advice about not pushing too hard to race the budget through the diet, upper house LDP members have formed a caucus of sorts to push back against the government. So I would ask at this point, if this is what Takaichi's relationship with the LDP looks like at the peak of her power, what will it look like when things get more challenging? When her popularity starts slipping, if the economy turns, what will it look like then? And I think that is a question to ask when we're looking at her durability. All right, I want to talk a little bit about post-populist politics because, of course, we all love to talk about populism now and the global spread of populism, and is Japan populist or not? Maybe this is a bolder claim, but I'm going to posit that one condition that prevailed during the Abe years was post-populist burnout. So contrary to the conventional wisdom that says Japan has generally been free of populism, I would argue that Japanese politics after the bursting of the bubble saw plenty of what is recognizable as populist politics. Bureaucrat bashing, Koizumi's war on the LDP's resistance forces, the DPJ's livelihoods first appeals, and of course they did plenty of bureaucrat bashing themselves. If you remember the Shiwake and having TV hearings, sort of Doge before there was a Doge. DPJ did it. So we've seen this. We've seen this kind of politics in Japan before. And I think, as a result of that, you saw a lot of political excitement. You saw a lot of drama, Koizumi's sort of drama politics and, naming his enemies and having these big rock star, political rallies. And you saw high turnout. You saw extraordinarily high turnout in the 2000s, basically from 2000 onward. 69% of the public voted in 2009. That is a huge moment for Japanese politics. Of course, that was the election that brought the DPJ into power. The Abe years, however, saw turnout plummet. Floating voters who drove those big turnouts checked out. The vote-gathering machines of the LDP and Komeito dominated. Is there a better illustration of this dynamic than the LDP returning to power in 2012 despite receiving 2 million or so fewer votes than in 2009, taking 294 seats compared with 119 in 2009, in an election in which turnout fell by 10 percentage points? I mean, that in some ways was the story of the Abe years, that independents stayed home, the LDP and Komeito machines did their work, and in election after election after election, the ruling coalition won and retained those stable majorities that enabled the government to control the diet and to govern in a very sort of consistent, persistent, durable way. Low turnout was the defining characteristic of Abe's 6 national electoral victories between 2012 and when he left in 2020. I think you might call it something of a political ice age. Takaichi, by contrast, faces a much more fluid political environment. The electorate is clearly more responsive to populist appeals again, particularly more right-wing appeals based on opposition to Japan's growing foreign population. The widespread adoption of social media, even compared to the Abe years when they started liberalizing laws about social media and politics, has lowered the barriers to entry for political outsiders able to use social media. I would say, look back, if you look at 2024, at the Tokyo gubernatorial election, when a virtually unknown small-town mayor from Hiroshima Prefecture came out of nowhere and finished second in Tokyo's gubernatorial election on a platform that I think you would struggle to find any concrete proposal at all. Not to mention, and again, I mentioned Sanseito earlier, and this is the time to talk about it, but the sudden rise of Sanseito last year between the Tokyo metropolitan election and then the upper house elections, a party that emerged as basically something of a eccentric anti-vax movement and then grew now into a nationwide political movement. And I would really caution you to look and see, this was a party that was able to run candidates across the country last year, ran candidates across the country this year, has really actually learned organizational lessons. If you look at the literature on the party's formation, has learned organizational lessons from both the Japanese Communist Party, which again, in election after election, they are fielding candidates across the country in practically every district. They've done it for years. And also from Komeito, which again has this vote gathering machine. And these are the parties that Sanseito has learned from. And what that tells me is that this is a party that doesn't expect to just be a fad party. They expect to have an organizational strength that enables them to ride the political winds and expect that there's going to be down moments, and then there's going to be moments where they're able to take advantage of having that organizational structure to ride events. We've seen turnout start to recover from the lows of the Abe years. In the 2025 upper house election, turnout reached 58.51%, which was the highest since 2007. This year's 56.26% turnout in the general election was the highest since the 2012 general election. The increase in turnout at least in part reflects higher youth turnout, and you can look at the official numbers on this. Younger voters seem more engaged. I mean, that really seems to be a part of the story of this gradual increase in turnout. Clearly, social media is an important part of the story. I don't think we can talk about it without looking at how younger people are engaging politics, how they're getting the information, how they're thinking about political issues. And I'm going to take a slight detour because I just think this information, this data is so fascinating, and would recommend, if you have the Japanese language abilities, to find the annual survey of media consumption habits that's conducted by the Japan Press Research Institute, because it tells you, if you want to understand Japanese politics, it's probably the single most important document to understand the political system right now, because it tells you essentially the information environments that different parts of the electoral system are living in now. And I want to just highlight a few of those data points, because I think it really will tell you the story of why you're seeing this populism driven by young voters and how young voters are thinking. So here are some highlights from the 2025 survey, which came out in October of last year. Asked what media they relied on to decide how to vote in last year's upper house election, the most common response, with 40% plus of voters in the 18 to 19 bracket, the under 29 bracket, and the under 39 bracket, was the internet. For those in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was commercial TV. For those over 70, 60% each said both newspapers, and 60% also said NHK. So you could answer as many as you wanted. So it didn't have to add up to 100. So already you're seeing older voters, they're reading newspapers. It's a very traditional media landscape. It's my media consumption habits. Younger voters, I mean, and I have some other data on this. I mean, younger voters are not reading newspapers. Interestingly, young people simultaneously identified both textual and visual media as places to encounter diverse viewpoints and get answers to questions, but also said that both are rife with disinformation and misinformation. So they know that it's a sort of a fire hose of garbage sometimes, but they're still turning to it. There's been a steady decline in newspaper readership just on the whole, from 47% in 2018 who said they read a newspaper daily to only 33.4% in 2025. Now Japan was sort of a holdout, right? You had newspapers with continuing to have circulations, world-beating circulations well after we started seeing circulations plummet in Europe and the United States. So Japan was a holdout, and we're starting to see actually Japan is catching up to its peers in that space. News consumption is lower among under 30s across the board, but even respondents in their 30s have shifted their news consumption to the internet. 60.3% of respondents in their 30s said they read internet news daily, compared with 20.3% who said they watch commercial TV daily, 6.9% who watch NHK daily, and 5.5% who read newspapers daily. Daily consumption of commercial TV, NHK, and newspapers increases with age. And so again, with my peers among the over 70s, apparently 73.6% watch NHK every day, 67.4% read newspapers every day, and 66.6% watch commercial TV every day. When it comes to political news in particular, this is how great the survey is, that it even breaks out asking, where are you getting political news? Where are you getting news about society? Where are you getting sports news? Respondents under 50 all favor the internet first, followed by commercial TV. No real surprise there. I mean, finally, just really want to stress the extent to which young people have abandoned newspapers, and that doesn't mean their newspaper reading has shifted online. That doesn't mean that they're getting news apps on their phone. I mean, they just have abandoned newspapers as sources of information. Period. When asked how they consume newspapers, the first age bracket in which there were more respondents who said that they have a monthly subscription than who said they don't read any newspapers or newspaper articles is in their 60s. So in every age bracket up until 60, you had more people saying, I don't read any newspapers or newspaper articles whatsoever, than subscribe to a monthly newspaper. 55.1% of those in their 40s, 66.9% of those in their 30s, 77.6% of those in their 20s, and 81.1% of those 18 and 19-year-olds say they do not read newspapers, period. Not online, not in news portals, just not at all. The survey is full of useful data points. Also on internet usage, I'm going to stop reciting these data points. I really strongly urge you to find it and to read it. But the through line of all of it is that older and younger Japanese increasingly inhabit distinct information environments. And if we want to go back to Benedict Anderson and Imagined Communities, news media, if it plays an important role in the formation of a national identity, what does it mean when you have essentially two countries when it comes to the information you're consuming? What does the nation look like? What do the politics of that nation look like when you have this kind of polarization in the very information that people are getting about the world and about politics? And Japan, of course, is hardly alone in this problem, and this is convergence in many ways with Japan's peers in the developed world. But it's happened very quickly. Where I think we saw a longer runway in other countries. In Japan, we're seeing this development happen. In a lot of ways, it's really post-2021 or post-2022. I mean, this has happened in an extremely short period of time, and it's had visible impacts on the country's politics. Really, I would argue that the political change we've seen in recent years is downstream of this change in the information environment and the growing role of social media. Increasingly, I think you find that you have one party system that's competing for older voters. So this would be the LDP and Komeito, the CDP, now Centrist Reform Alliance, the Japanese Communist Party, and you have a whole different slate of parties competing for young voters. You have the Democratic Party for the People, you have Sanseito, you have Isshin no Kai to some extent, although you have to bracket it since it's a regional party. With the LDP seemingly is the only party that has shown an ability to appeal to voters of all ages, though I think we might say that it probably depends on who's leading the party, because Ishiba, when he led the LDP, the party showed no sign of appealing to the young, and that was a big factor in the party's defeat in last year's upper house elections. You increasingly have the parties for the newspaper readers, and you have the parties for the YouTube viewers. That is, maybe a simple way of putting it, but that is what the political system looks like now. Whether because younger voters are more conservative, and I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole now, although I think it's not quite as straightforward as that, or because they're simply hungry for change and parties that appear to be more responsive to their concerns, particularly some of their quality of life concerns, Takaichi has shown an ability to capture these younger voters for the LDP. Her poll numbers have consistently been strongest among the youngest and weakest among the old. So very different, in fact, in some ways the exact opposite of what it looked like when Ishiba was at the head of the LDP. However, and I think this is really the key point, I would ask whether this is a firm base of support for a durable LDP and Takaichi-led government. These are voters without firm attachments. These are not the LDP machine voters, perhaps without even firm commitments to turning out to vote. Can you rely on these young floating voters to show up every time an election comes along? I don't know if you can say that yet. They consume information sources that they themselves acknowledge are rife with misinformation. And Takaichi has to some extent already been in a bidding war with some of her competitors for young voters, with Sanseito on anti-migrant policies, with the DPFP on tax cuts and other benefits for young people. Her ability to follow through on these populist bids could influence her ability to keep these voters loyal to her and to the LDP. And of course, she has to convince her own party to go along with some of these populist policies where you have an undercurrent within the LDP that thinks that actually the tax cuts she's proposed are irresponsible and they don't want to go along with that. So there's risks to her bidding for support from these voters when her own party is not necessarily prepared to go along with it. Ultimately, the new floating voters may be more floaty than yesterday's floating voters, and today's disruptor may be tomorrow's disrupted. I think what we're seeing is the pace of change, the possibility of rapid disruption is higher than we've seen. And I want to be mindful of time. So we'll move on to the next thing. A stable international environment. One factor I think that he influenced Takaichi's ability to deliver for the voters is the overall health of the economy, and that of course clearly depends in many ways on geopolitical conditions outside of her control. I don't think it's fully appreciated the extent to which Abe, the second Abe administration, depended on what in retrospect looks like a relatively benign global environment. The global economy was growing, no major international financial shocks, and many of Japan's peers, not least the United States, welcomed Abe's efforts to jumpstart Japan's economy via Abenomics, even if it meant a weaker yen. The US was pivoting to Asia with mixed success to be sure, but it was taking the region more seriously, and both the Obama and I would say the first Trump administrations valued Abe's Japan as an indispensable partner in competition with China. Even when global shocks did occur, Brexit, Trump's election, these shocks may have actually strengthened Abe domestically and probably helped him weather the scandals of the back half of his administration, and that by that time he could say he was an experienced statesman and he was the only one who could be trusted to guide Japan through a dangerous world. But it may not be an accident that when a serious global crisis with implications for Japan did occur, the COVID-19 pandemic, Abe ultimately could not survive politically. And we can discuss the extent to which the pandemic contributed to stress, which contributed to his ulcerative colitis flaring up again. Meanwhile, Takaichi has inherited from her predecessors a sense that Japan faces a greater set of dangers than it has at any time since 1945. The 2020s have felt like a series of shocks exposing the degree to which Japan is at risk, starting with COVID's exposure of Japan's vulnerability to supply chain disruptions, China's growing military power and its willingness to use economic coercion, which Japan, of course, was a canary in the coal mine for, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the shock that delivered to the Japanese people of what warfare can look like in the 21st century. We've seen Russia's deepening alliance with China and North Korea, which, if you listen to Japanese political rhetoric, there is now common discussion about Japan being on the front line facing 3 nuclear powers right across the waters. And now you've had the rolling crisis for Japan that has been the second Trump administration, which has, among other things, I think created a sense of cognitive dissonance in Tokyo, that Japan is dependent for its security on a partner that is A, led by a fundamentally unpredictable and unreliable president, and B, a country and ally that is fundamentally undermining the rules-based order that for Japan is not an empty rhetorical gesture. And I would stress that. This is not just a rhetorical flourish for Japan, but rather something that Japan has viewed as a fundamental guarantee of its national security and its prosperity. And if you don't believe me, I would recommend looking at the 2022 National Security Strategy, which makes this very clear. I mean, they're very committed to the idea that Japan's national interest, the existence of a rules-based order, is a national interest for Japan. Finally, not only is the global economy more challenging, Japan's own economic situation is more complicated. The demographic crunch that everyone was viewing as a distant challenge is here. The inflation Japan that Abe wanted has arrived. Interest rates are rising, complicating Takeuchi's plans for more spending and raising the risk of an adverse financial market reaction. The feeling that Japan is at a historical turning point, which was a phrase that Kishida Fumio in particular was fond of using, is widespread, as is the sense that assumptions about the world that Japan has been able to take for granted for most of the post-war period no longer hold. On the one hand, as with Abe, this acute sense of threat may work in Takeuchi's favor. She is, I would say, obsessed with threats to Japan's security and has made increasing Japan's autonomy and its self-reliance fundamental to her political identity and to her political program. This is why she is in power. It is very clear she believes that there's a lot that needs to be done, and she thinks she's the agent for making Japan more secure. If the public feels that Japan faces risks and she's either grappling with them in legible ways or working hard to navigate some acute crisis, that could bind the public closer to her, particularly if it appears that there's no plausible alternative for navigating this threat environment. However, as the ongoing Hormuz crisis has shown, there may simply be events that happen that harm Japan for which the government has no easy answer, particularly when it comes to impacts on the domestic economy. Takeuchi's response to the Hormuz crisis has in many respects been to downplay the impact on Japan, using oil stockpiles and fuel subsidies to limit the short-term impact in the hopes that the crisis can be resolved soon, sidestepping questions about the legality of the war to avoid friction with the US, and looking at diversification of oil supplies over the longer term. But the longer the crisis continues, the more strain this approach will take. The broader point is that the international system is more uncertain than in the past. The potential for shocks that could disrupt Japan in ways that challenge Japan's leaders has grown, and it may be harder for Takeuchi or other LDP leaders to attract voters with the appeal, vote for us because we'll keep you safe in a dangerous world. Finally, I do want to talk just briefly about the importance of leadership style. And I've talked for a while and I'm mindful of time and I want to hear questions, so I will try to keep this section brief. But I will say that leadership actually is very important. It's something that's sometimes hard to study in political science, but you can learn a lot about a leader's style, how they take in information, how they make decisions, and that can tell us a lot about their ability to last in power. An important part of Abe's success in his second administration was that he had learned from the failure of his first. And in fact, I would argue one of the things that makes him unique, I think, not just among politicians, but among people, was his ability to learn from failure. I mean, I remember when he resigned in 2007, and it was about as big of a failure on as big of a stage as you could possibly have, and really the first real failure he had in his life. And to recover from that in the way that he recovered from that, and sort of this deliberate process, I mean, he kept these notebooks, reflecting on what went wrong, is an extraordinary thing. I think it is an extraordinary thing for a person to be able to learn from failure in that way. And it's part of the reason I ended up writing my book, because I just thought for someone to come back from that sort of personal tragedy and personal disaster and pick themselves up and re-enter the arena, I mean, it's a really an extraordinarily rare thing. So among the lessons he learned, I mean, in his first government, he relied on a small circle of ideological loyalists. He had put his own personal ideological crusade ahead of addressing the public's needs. He did not know how to marshal and invest his political capital for the long haul. When he came back, he had a more experienced leadership team around him in the Prime Minister's office, starting with Suga Yoshihide as his chief cabinet secretary. And this was a group that combined personal loyalty. They were people who had stuck with him, but they were also, I think, uniquely competent. Importantly, this was a team that could also tell Abe when he was wrong and pushed him in different directions and argued with him. I've heard it described that he had something of an imperial court around him. He had advisors who could argue with each other and make a decision together, and then that decision would be implemented. And Abe was willing to follow the decision of the group as they deliberated on their options. Takeuchi, by contrast, is a loner. She has few close, trusted advisors in government with her. As we've discussed, she does not have a robust base of support in the LDP itself. She has a tendency to defer to her own judgment and a tendency to be a gambler. And again, we saw this with calling a snap election. Everyone was saying, don't call a snap election yet, you need to do more, you need more time. And she made the decision basically by herself, I'm gonna call an election, I'm going to do this. We saw this also with her decision to press ahead to pass the budget in only a month's time, and that went a little less well. We got a taste of this also recently when she reportedly got in a shouting match with Imai Takiya, who of course had been basically Abe's chief of staff, and is now back advising her in the Prime Minister's office. But the press was all over reports about a shouting match over whether to dispatch ships to the Strait of Hormuz. And I think it is very telling that you had a veteran of that Abe group decision-making style now back in government, and finding a prime minister maybe not as interested in hearing his thoughts and encountering pushback. And so I think these questions of how information reaches the prime minister, whether and how she hears dissenting views, how she makes decisions, all of these things I think can be incredibly important in determining a prime minister's longevity in office. So I'll conclude and say that there is absolutely no doubt that Takaichi is an impressive figure. She's climbed from almost a uniquely modest background for a Japanese politician, and succeeded in a world that's dominated by men, and not just dominated by men, but dominated by men who've often benefited from political inheritances that have smoothed their path to power. No better example than Abe himself. It is really no small feat that she won the premiership. I mean, it really is an extraordinary achievement, and it's worth reckoning with the fact that she is not a lightweight. She's not someone who got there by happenstance or was installed there to be controlled by others. But when considering whether, having won the premiership, she will be positioned to keep it for a long duration, it is important to recognize that only 6 of Japan's 39 post-war governments have lasted at least 4 years. The odds have generally been stacked against every prime minister who has taken office. And while I have focused on the most recent of these examples today, in general, all of them have depended on a certain mix of luck and skill to endure. As impressive as her electoral victory was and her popularity is, we should be mindful that even now, at what may well be the peak of her power, there are warning signs that we should take seriously. And with that, I'll stop. I know I had 45 minutes, I was at 46, so
That's pretty good. Thanks. That was great. So we didn't talk about this before, but Q&A. We'll call the question, but I just have about, I think 614 questions. So if it's okay, we'll just talk for half.
yeah, we can. I mean, look, I'm sure people would get a lot of
It'd be
just
fascinating.
talking. Yeah, absolutely.